Welcome to the panel on Islamophobia and public policy. And we have four extraordinary individuals here who, if you were part of the beginning panel, who do not stay quiet. And as a person representing a human rights organization, I am extremely grateful for all of them and the great work they're doing in our country and world. But I will jump right ahead. I know you're not here to hear me. And many of you heard Corey Saylor start out, but I will read his bio anyway so you can think about all his great accomplishments while he's talking with you. Corey Saylor is the Managing Director for Security and Rights at Rethink Media. In this role, he works with a specialized team of Rethink professionals to protect human and civil rights in a post-9/11 world. He has spent over 20 years in nonprofit advocacy, working on political communications, media relations, and combating anti-Islam prejudice in the United States. He has run successful advocacy campaigns holding major companies such as Burger King, American Express, and Bell Helicopter Boeing accountable for their corporate policies, as well as combating anti-Islam legislation nationwide and removing biased and inaccurate materials from law enforcement counterterrorism trainings. Corey has also authored a number of reports documenting anti-Islam sentiment and civil rights issues in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Corey Saylor back. Go ahead.
Go, okay. Go. I always have a great moment of discomfort after introduction. So, so if you were in the last session, I hinted a little bit at the conversation around anti-Islam law. It's often called anti-Sharia bills, but I prefer the term anti-Islam because, let's face it, that's what it's about. And so for today, although there's lots of public policy we could talk about, Muslim ban, I want to focus on the anti-Islam legislation because it's more pernicious and it sort of gives the extent of Islamophobia in a different viewpoint. I think everybody's familiar with it at the federal level at this point. So since 2010, there have been 201 anti-Islam bills introduced in 43 states. And 12 states have passed these bills. The most famous incident was in Oklahoma. I just needed the notes because the numbers are new. Southern Poverty Law Center just updated them a month or so ago. So the most famous one of these was in Oklahoma, where voters were asked to vote on a modification to the Oklahoma state constitution that said something along the lines of, should judges in the state of Oklahoma be allowed to consider foreign law or Sharia law, which is derived from the Quran and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad. So I mean, literally, this is what is in the bill. When you go in to vote on election day, that is what is there in front of you. And by an overwhelming majority, 74%, voters that day decided to enact that piece of legislation. For obvious reasons, we sued them 2 days later. And we got hit with, or I was overwhelmed with a number of calls from people calling me a traitor, telling me you're trying to destroy the Constitution, and all kinds of variations of that. Many people in the Muslim community were concerned because let's not rock the boat, right? We don't want people to focus on us. My sense was, this is unconstitutional, we need to sue. 3 years later, judges in that area, not an area known as being particularly progressive, agreed with us and struck down the bill. So it is not law. So what Oklahoma did is they went back to the drawing board and drew on a template piece of legislation written by a gentleman named David Yerushalmi. He tends to be the one whose legislation is most often used in these cases. And what his template does is it bans the use of foreign law. So you get around First Amendment issues by not mentioning Islam specifically, but everybody knows what you're talking about. In politics, it's called a dog whistle. You mention something and everybody hears what you actually intend. So when you look at the debates around these bills, it's always we have to be afraid of Sharia. It's not the 10 Commandments are coming to take over America, because that's foreign law as well. Sorry, my voice is starting to go. I've got a Ricola trying to help me out a little bit. But so this is not something, right, it's not something that like appeared when Donald Trump came into office. This has been around for a while. This has been going on for a long time, and it's a struggle we've had for a while. So rather than talk too much, I want to give you 3 different ways that I've seen people engage on these things that has been enormously effective, because I want you, when you leave here today, to think about what it is that we can be doing. And if you're a lawyer, I think I just gave away my favorite way possible, which is to litigate these things. It's more difficult when they pass the foreign law version, but lawyers have told me it is possible to do. But what's more fun to do is when the legislature is considering it, we've just sort of developed a letter that we send that says, if you pass this bill, we will sue you, and here's why we will win. For a legal letter, it's wonderful. It's only 1 page rather than the 40 pages that is normal for legal stuff. And it has this enormous effect. I don't know how many times I've seen bills pulled within days of us sending this letter. But there's many other tricks. One thing that I've seen many times in other states, the local community gets connected to the state legislature. And if you're not involved in state level politics, definitely now is the time to consider it. Federal politics is much more difficult. State legislators are far more responsive to you and easier to get a hold of. And it's better to be engaged with them starting now, so that when you need to talk to them about something really important to you, they already know who you are. It's like, oh God, Corey's calling and he's not going to stop until I answer him. So, right? They sort of know that. And what I've seen happen, and I'm not even going to mention the state because they do this sort of annually, and I don't want to give away where they're at, but an anti-Islam bill will be introduced. They will get all their community members to go down to the legislature, and they are connected down there because they've been doing this for a long time. And they go down, they speak to the appropriate legislators, and as if by magic, the bill never gets scheduled for a hearing. So if you want to be effective on this kind of stuff, being engaged in local politics is one of the best ways possible. Even better if you run for office. Those things can sound like a lot because, oh, well, you know, I've got to be engaged in politics a lot, or I've got to know law. But I would argue to you that's not the case. There is one state, and again, I'm sorry I can't mention names, but some of these things, because they're effective because they're under the radar. There's one state I know where the active Muslim community is essentially one individual who is incredible, but because she takes the time to go around and make these connections, she has successfully been able to undermine multiple anti-Muslim bills. So I want you all, when you're hearing things today, to recognize that while the news often looks bad, the things happening behind the scenes on policy fronts can often be incredibly inspiring. Mm-hmm. And I want you to walk away with that piece of optimism, because while the news often looks bad, America remains a place where individuals like us can get involved and have a massive impact. And I say that because I guarantee you I'm nobody special. And yet, because I've been involved in politics for a while, I've been able to see these wonderful things happen behind the scenes because I have connections with people in the States, people who, like you, come to forums like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Corey. Now introduce John Keller. He'll talk about Minnesota. John graduated cum laude from Hamlin School of Law. He worked for the Immigrant Law Center as a staff attorney from 1998 to 2004, specializing in naturalization, deportation defense, and family reunification. In 2005, he became the executive director and has overseen the growth of ILCM into the state's largest provider of immigration, legal, education, and policy services. He helped create a state government task force on immigration and several strong and diverse coalitions for immigration reform and improved public policies. In 2007, his leadership in responding to the immigration raids in Worthington, Minnesota, led to individual and organizational recognition. Mr. Keller's leadership has been honored by the Minnesota Hispanic Bar Association, immigrants' rights organizations, and the Mexican Consulate. He has twice been named as Attorney of the Year by Minnesota Lawyer newspaper. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to just start out and kind of talk about the work that I think somebody referenced in the first panel of intersectionality, which I think is really a place where I see hope, you know, whether it be young people, including my own young adult kids and their peers, to the different immigrant and refugee groups that we have the honor of working with in Minnesota and across the country. I do see federal immigration law and the challenges that we're dealing with principally as a legal organization and policy organization on the federal level having the opposite effect of what was intended by those who are promoting them, to divide, to exclude. We do see intersectionality really building bridges and stronger relationships, and even relationships that didn't exist by the affected community as well as allied communities. And I'm thrilled to include the work that we've been doing for years, but most importantly, since this new administration has really taken on front and center attacks on Muslims, on refugees, and that fluidity in which they interchange those, while at the same time seeking to criminalize immigrants and deport, arrest in record numbers and record speed. I was asked to talk a little bit about state and local issues at this, here in Minnesota, and I think I would echo exactly what Corey said at one point, and the importance of being engaged. He referenced the state level. I would add the local level, and you'll see that by a couple of the examples that I'll use. On the positive side, you saw just around Christmas, Hennepin County Board for the first time approving $250,000 to provide for deportation defense for people going through deportation with county dollars. So that happened because of concerted action. And then I'll talk about some of the other cities. I also will talk a little bit about maybe two trends in interest of time at the state level here in Minnesota, and then also kind of an overview of what we've seen in states dealing with legislation that Corey's already referenced. So I went to college for a couple of years at St. John's in central Minnesota, and I worked on social justice issues at that time, and became acutely aware of the difference in greater Minnesota than in the metro in terms of interactions with people who are different, particularly people because of skin tone, and at that point there were not Somalis in significant numbers or any. But I think those trends have been present everywhere that ILCM does work, particularly in greater Minnesota. The more recent the interaction between new arrivals, particularly if you're of a different religion and a different skin color, the more likely we've seen conflict. And St. Cloud, I think for me and for folks who've been working in this area, has been an area where that persistent bubbling up of hatred has existed for a long time. The first example, and it dovetails with the Fargo-Moorhead area, are both a sign of concern and a sign of hope. So in both of those geographical locations, there's a history of racism and intolerance by individuals and by elected officials. The most recent efforts in both of those geographical areas were to introduce legislation at the local level to stop refugee resettlement. A moratorium in St. Cloud was introduced in the fall of 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Things have blurred together in terms of keeping track of incidents. And it received a tremendous amount of media coverage and also local participation. And again, I think this dovetails what Corey was encouraging. And instead of the city council in St. Cloud, and similarly the city council in Fargo, passing legislation or resolutions to limit refugees, overwhelmingly counter resolutions were passed declaring both of those local jurisdictions welcoming cities. If you remember, there were dueling images of people in the crowd. In St. Cloud, over 300 people showed up for city council hearings. I guarantee you there's never been 300 people showing up for St. Cloud city council hearings. And if you go to a regular meeting in any municipality, it's probably 20 people. That's a good night. My dad was a local elected official my entire upbringing, and he knew every single person who would show up. So that gives me a sign of hope. Both of those municipalities joined a growing number of mostly cities in Minnesota that have proactively come out and declared themselves welcoming jurisdictions. And I also can guarantee you that happened because of local involvement. And I think it was again spurred perhaps in reaction to somebody who wanted to take the city in a different direction, who was quickly out-organized and out-represented. I'm looking at some of you who were there in St. Cloud, so thank you for doing that. And that is a sign of our ability to make change and also to find ways to push back against the national debate on our local levels. So those, I'm going to kind of skip over more detail on those two cities and go right into some of the state issues, and happy to try to come back to those if there's questions that I can help with. At the state level, Minnesota has been part of the trend that Corey and others have talked about, where anti-foreign law or anti-Sharia laws bills have been introduced. We've had 3 in Minnesota, dating back as far back as 2012, 2015, and 2016. ILCM has been part of, as the bio introduced, broad coalitions that have been working on immigration policy, on refugee policy at the state and federal levels. These were some of those bills that came up. None of them became law, but I always consider them never done or never dead. We're still dealing with a couple this session that would penalize sanctuary cities, would penalize Hennepin County or any other county that dedicates dollars. So those issues are always there at the state level. The other way in which Muslims and refugees have been attacked at the state level has been, and at the local level I will say too, is to say they cost too much. So you'll hear this a lot about, you know, who's paying for this? Why is St. Cloud being voiceless or have no power to control how many people come to St. Cloud? And so what that's resulted in, it resulted in legislation at the state level here in Minnesota to audit the cost of refugees. Those bills did not advance and make it to the governor's desk, but what did happen in 2017 was the Office of Legislative Auditor, relatively obscure part of the state government, was asked to take on the auditing or to try to answer these questions. What does it cost the state, counties, and cities to take on refugees? That report was issued March 1st, 2018. If you haven't seen it, it's worth looking at as part of what I think is a continuation of, or a continuum of trying to otherize people who are foreign-born, and in this case, Muslims and refugees. Not surprisingly, the audit itself, or the report itself, says it's nearly impossible to do this for some really interesting reasons, and I'll close with this. Some of the challenges that they found was most attempts to measure immigrants or refugees' cost and benefit never examine a long enough period of time. About 50% of refugees who come to Minnesota are 18 years of age and younger. One of the things, looking back to an old report issued by Governor Pawlenty when he was governor in 2015, he attributed the cost to the state of, quote, illegal immigrants to the public education of those children 18 and under. And the same thing happens when you try to evaluate how much does a child produce that's valuable while they're in high school or middle school or elementary school. So a problem just in the way in which the auditor tried to even set up rubrics to do this. And how much does a refugee child cost going through our school system versus, we never measure the cost of a US born child unless, of course, we question their parentage. The other thing that they found is that, as we in the immigration world know, the status somebody arrives with is dynamic. When you arrive as a refugee or if you get asylum, within 1 year you are eligible to apply to have a green card. Most government entities do not require, and in some cases prohibit, the tracking of immigration status for public policy purposes. So if you only take a snapshot of Southeast Asians that arrived in Minnesota as refugees from 1979 to 1983, many of them within a year or 2 years are no longer refugees but permanent residents. And of course, the third thing is we have no systems in place to track people over a long period of time. So that audit, in lots of ways, we look at and say, we knew that you would get that result. Do we think it will be the end of trying to say refugees are too costly for cities? No. Those conversations will still happen. But at least at the state level, I don't think there's a lot that can be taken away from that audit to justify turning people away. In fact, there's a lot that's positive in it. And in some of the cities that also were trying to do audits, St. Cloud and Fargo, there are very positive data provided by city planners as to why we actually need to keep attracting folks. Let me just check and make sure I didn't forget anything. An important thing I was happy to see in the report was recognition of a treaty the U.S. has signed on to since 1951 that allows refugees to choose, once they've been resettled in a resettlement country, to live wherever they like. So we still have not yet said if you arrive in Austin, Texas, you must remain in Austin, Texas. And those raise some of the same constitutional issues that we hope will apply regardless of status. So with that, I'll end and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, John. John and Corey are leaders of really important nonprofit organizations who are working to protect the human rights and civil rights of people living in the United States. And now our next two panelists are extraordinary individuals who have busy professional lives that are not part of that struggle, but have jumped in the deep end of the ocean to be part of the democratic process and to make change through public policy in the way that I think this country was founded, with citizen activism. And so we're thrilled they can be here with us. I'll start with Zarina. She'll speak next. Zarina Baber was recognized by the AARP and Pollen as one of the over 50 leaders in Minnesota in 2017. Zarina has a 30-year history of being a community organizer, an activist, and a human rights advocate. She served on the board of the Advocates for Human Rights, my organization. Zarina founded the Al-Shifa Free Clinic in 1995 and was the recipient of the annual Asian Pacific Leadership Award in 2001 and was recognized by Senator Mark Dayton in the U.S. Senate that same year. Zarina is a founding member of the first National Muslim Caucus and serves as the vice president of its board. Zarina has a bachelor's from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota and a master's in technology management from the University of St. Thomas. And she has an extensive career in information technology. But she's going to talk about her activism today.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning. I think it might be almost late morning. And assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here and to share some of my experiences with political activism to the degree that I was able to participate in it. It's a very well-known fact that in 2016 election is being considered a wake-up call for Muslims around the nation. Okay? But for me, the wake-up call happened on April 19th, 1995. Does anyone remember that day? What day it was? Oklahoma City bombing. Okay. Two people, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, were the individuals who were responsible for this truck bombing that killed 168 people and injured more than 680 individuals. The damage was to 324 other buildings other than the federal building that they were targeting, and estimated damage $652 million. So how does this relate to me? Soon after that incident, the very same day, judgment came swift in the media. I think earlier we talked about the influence of media, and all the pundits came on the media, all the politicians came, and started to speculate about who it could potentially be. And obviously the dialogue was around potential Muslim individuals who may have done that. But as this was even before the smoke cleared, there was talk. The same day, my son, both my sons went to a private school in St. Paul. I picked them up from school, and on the way back, my older son, who was in high school, broke down. A gentleman, he's nothing more than a pure gentleman, and Robin knows him. And the reason for that is, within hours of this bombing, an individual, one of his classmates, or a couple of them actually, on his locker, they posted a big card. It looked like a big card that they drew up on with a bomb on it, and "Your dad" written on it. And he was distraught all night long. It affected me personally. It hit me home. And that's when I realized racism is here. It's simmering, and I'm talking about this being a private school where kids came from affluential families, and a liberal school at that. So I started to think, we lived in Blaine at that time, I started to think about, if this could happen in a private school, I wonder what rural Minnesota and schools out there might look like. So it was at that point in time, my family and I made up our minds to get more involved politically. Fortunately for us, we intersected with our late Senator Paul Wellstone. His ideals really touched our core, and we started to get involved in the political process. Fast forward 20 years. June 2015, Donald Trump announces that he wants to run for president, and Islamophobia, divisiveness, hatred have all gone mainstream. So our struggle was on a couple of different folds as we were trying to get involved with the Democratic Party. We were immigrants to this country, citizens, but our first experience with the political process, we didn't know how to maneuver the process. We had to learn, but we soon realized either it's your money or your vote that's going to get you the influence, whether it's at the local level or the state level or at the federal level. And our community had none of that. There was no awareness in our community on the importance of being civically engaged, because they all came from, especially from India, Pakistan, very comfortable environments, so they did not have this struggle. So getting them to be aware of and the importance of being involved so that we could ultimately influence our own environment was a huge challenge. But Donald Trump changed all that for us. All of a sudden now, thankfully, maybe it's the wrong driver, but our community is more aware, more sensitive, and is more engaged. But to take on what we were hearing at a national level in the televisions and in the debates of the presidential elections, we felt we needed a bolder approach than just individuals being part of a process where we did not have the influence, we still did not have the money, we were still struggling to bring our community on board, but we needed a much bolder approach. And the bolder approach we took was, some of us, led by Ghazala Salam out of Florida, we formed a national Muslim caucus. We met in Baltimore in 2017, February, and officially formed this organization. We had board members from multiple different states, including Alaska, and wrote the bylaws and officially formed it. We have an advisory committee board. It was a start of a movement. And our goal is to take this voice to the grassroots level, provide support, and educate, empower, build our electoral base across the nation. And the way we plan on doing that is to build those coalitions, the importance of coalitions we talked about this morning. Not just with Muslim organizations. There are several Muslim organizations who are struggling on an individual basis. Our goal is to bring them together and to be able to provide and share best practices. So ultimately, we are able to be an influential entity within our country. Fortunately for us, DNC supported our idea. And we have an advisory board. We have Congressman Keith Ellison on it, as well as our own DFL chair, Ken Martin. And there are others, Sean Kennedy of Jetpack. I don't know if one of you know, Shahid Amanullah, who's a media giant for us. He's my cousin. Ken Evans, who's also a DNC member. So we're building this coalition and partnership and support with anyone who is willing to support our ideals. And the inroads we have made, both at the national, we have 2 states that have already become members of our organization. One is Minnesota, under the leadership of Asad Zaman, and the other one is Florida. Virginia is willing to become a member, so we're going through that process. And we also have a struggle in the sense that these individual organizations, we don't have a name brand yet. We're trying to get there with all our activities. The first year, we spent a lot of time building out the infrastructure, but now we're out there, out in the community. And every one of the board members is doing this on a volunteer basis. None of them are paid. This is not their full-time job. So we're working members of this board. We found a very good partner with our local DFL, Mr. Ken Martin, who also happens to be I believe he was elected as the chair of the Association of State Democratic Chairs. He will be introducing us to other chairs across the different states so we can provide support top-down while working bottom-up with the individual organizations and building that coalition. So we call this an awesome responsibility that we have undertaken, but we feel like failure is not an option at this time. Everyone is willing to put more than 150 to 200% into this to make this a reality, because the driving force is if we don't write our own destiny, then somebody else will. And the driving force is April 19th, 1995, my son, for me. So bringing it back home. So those are some of the things we're doing. But so there's a lot of challenge ahead of us. I talked about empowering bringing our community, the Muslim community, along. Fortunately, in the 20 years, a new generation of community activists have come up on the Muslim scene that I'm very, very hopeful about. They're just incredible, savvy, very confident young people that I feel like we can just empower them and say, go run, and they will get it done for us. Brilliant, brilliant young people. And the other challenge is, and how do we deal with Islamophobia coming from the GOP? And that has been a challenge because while they know the truth, I think there's some selective hearing that we encounter when we go to talk to them, our elected officials. And the third, even within the Democratic, so majority of Muslims feel that the Democratic Party is a very welcoming organization, but even within that, there are elements who actually don't view Muslims very favorably. There was a recent Pew Research finding that showed when they polled the Democrats and the Republicans, majority of them just had said, on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being the coldest and 100 being the warmest, how do you feel about Muslims? It fell at 47 from the Democrats. So, yeah, so our struggle is going to be multifold, but that is where we need the help of multiple organizations to help us, provide us, give us that voice so we can. We want to be in the lead. We want to make our own changes and take responsibility for our own future. But we need everybody's support. And that's what the National Muslim Caucus is trying to drive, and in building that coalition. It's not going to be a year, 2-year effort. It's going to be a long term. We have to build a model that's going to be sustainable and successful in the long term. And the only way we can do it is like Robin Phillips's organization and Ken Martin and other Jetpack and other organizations that are willing to give us the support.
Thank you, Zarina.
Sure.
Our next panelist is Rashed Verdes. He's the president and a certified speaker of the Islamic Resource Group. He has been involved with various interfaith activities in the Rochester, Twin Cities, and Greater Minnesota. Rashed is one of the board of Rashed is one of the board of directors of the Rochester Mosque. He received the Rochester Mayor's Medal of Honor for his community work in the community. He is an active Islamic religious volunteer in several federal and state prisons and county jails and has been doing it for over 10 years. He has a master's degree in computer science and is a software architect by profession. Recently, Rashed got involved with the Republican Party and was elected an alternate to represent Minnesota SD 35 for the GOP. Rashed?
Thank you. So, assalamu alaikum, peace be upon all of you. I'm usually the odd man out wherever I go. So, when my moment to dovetail with what Sister Zarina was talking about was when I was freshman in St. Cloud State University. I was freshman student. It was a world music class. We used to go to a theater where we'd play, we'd watch a movie or something, and we'd write a report on that. So I was a little late on that day, and I walked in there, and I see 2 buildings burning. So I thought it was just a part of the movie, but only to realize that that was September 11, 2001. It was real. So that was the time on campus things changed a lot, and I was just a freshman, and as a Muslim, we'd go to a room and do the Friday prayers every Friday, all these things we're doing. And then all the Muslims on campus went into hiding, pretty much. So nobody wants to be the center of attention. Nobody wants to answer these questions. And then I started hearing questions, a lot of things about Islam that I didn't know being Muslim as a born Muslim. Like Muslims beat their wives, they have 4 wives, Sharia is like, plucking your eye out and stuff like that. I was like, really? I don't know any of these things. It was very strange. So then I realized if I don't speak about myself and Muslims, then someone else will, and they will fill in the blank. So that was my inspiration to kind of get involved, to learn my own religion first. And that's something I would recommend Muslims first to do. Just learn your own religion first, and then develop a way to explain that in simple terms to others that are, that probably don't know. So from St. Cloud State, I graduated and moved to Rochester to work for a private company in IT. And in Rochester, I started getting involved in more. I got involved in an organization called Islamic Resource Group. So it's a grassroots organization that when I say grassroots, it's literally grassroots. So we send speakers to audiences where maybe there's one person we're talking to. So literally one person at a time. And then, so that's what I got involved, and I lead that organization now as the Speakers Bureau, and we have many speakers that go out and speak about Islam. Then we moved to the Senate District 35, which is Congressional District 3. If you don't know what these means, please, by all means, learn these and get involved. I didn't know any of these stuff until like 8 months ago. I started getting involved because I realized this is very, very important. We have to get involved. The way I did that was kind of strange. I looked up who is the one that represents me, and I just called her and invited her for dinner. And say, I'm a Muslim in this area, and I hear a lot of bad things, and I like some of the party platform, which is GOP, some of the things, but I just can't feel that I can go there because it's like the stuff that comes out of it is bad. So that's how I kind of got involved, and I really like what Corey was saying, that they're very accessible, so please start locally. So that's how I got involved. Local politician that goes to St. Paul and makes laws. And then what happened was then I went to the caucus, and all of these, you know, anti-Islamic bills that come, they start from that level. It's in your local caucus. That's where it starts. And I will tell you confidently what I have seen. It is because of the lack of Muslims being there, speaking out against them and clarifying to what these are, is why these things pass the local and go up to the next one and the next one, and then ends up being in a state legislature like that. So what I have experienced is when I went to these caucuses, some of these were introduced. I stood up, I spoke against them. But before that, you need to do a little bit of homework. You need to know what these are and how to speak about them. What are the core issues, and like 3 bullet points answers to all these things. Then speak out and clarify. And then those are overwhelmingly voted down. Nobody voted for them except the people that brought it in. Then I went to the congressional district, GOP, district CD, you know, or the convention for our Senate district, actually. It came up again. So I stood up, I said, okay, well, you think that Sharia is going to replace the Constitution? Well, majority of the Christians in this country are not able to put a cross on a park. You think all of a sudden less than 1% of the population will overthrow the Constitution and replace it with something else? So these are the bullet points that you need to really understand how to say those, and that really shakes people. So ignorance and in general, human beings, this is in all of our nature. This is our innate nature, is that when you would have doubt by nature at the best, or fear when something that you don't know. So like if there is an alien drops here right now, we're not gonna go and try to shake his hand, or if there is a hand, or whatever it is. You see? So that's in our nature. We're gonna doubt the intention, or most of us are probably gonna run. So that's the same thing for Muslims. So Muslims, most people don't know what Islam is. Unfortunately, they know a lot, but they know the negatives. So Muslims start from negative to 0 and then positive. So that's what IRG do. So what is happening in these caucuses, what I felt was, when I was there, like I said, most people had no clue about what Sharia is, so they're just believing what their fellow GOPer is saying about what it is. For the lack of a voice. I'm telling you, what my experience in GOP so far is have been more than welcoming, and I'm not here to recruit anybody. I'm just saying that there are many people came to me and said, you are welcome here. I said, well, I thought so, because there's nothing that says I'm not welcome. But, so when I spoke up against that anti-Sharia bills, people were saying, oh, they don't believe in Jesus. I can hear people in the back, you know. You have to be really brave to do that, you know, just you're one person there. So things like that you have to counter. So the key things is I talked about Sharia, anti-Sharia, and the example of Sharia creeping in. You know, some of those people quote the FGM, female genital mutilation. That is example of Sharia coming in. So you have to counter that clearly. And then when I said that, you know, this is actually as a party, GOP, who embraces religion kind of a little bit more than I would say in other parties. For them to speak out against a religion is kind of like, what are you doing? So you're destroying your own platform, basically. So I just pointed some of these things out, and then it was voted down overwhelmingly. So that was my experience caucusing. So I would end with this. My analysis is Islamophobia in general. It is a top-down approach. It's not bottom-up. What are the bottom grassroots? Remember, in every one of us, in our heart, we have fear or doubt. So from the top, some people realize that they can use Islamophobia to do whatever, win election and do many things. So they tap into those, our innate natures, by spending money and spending ad and those. So the way to counter that, we have to be, we have to do it from both sides, because it's coming from both. So at the grassroots is what I can make a difference, is to educate, to counter that unknown. So to make Islam not an unknown anymore. To tell people what is Islam, who you are, and give good examples of Muslims. So you counter that unknown. And then if you counter that unknown, then the top-down is not going to work that easy. Because people will say, oh, I know Rashad, he's not like that. See, that is the key. If you read the news about Catholics, you will hear nothing good about Catholics until the last pope. The same as Islam. One of the things we need to educate ourselves is how we consume news. Something is in the news is because it is exceptional. It is out of the ordinary. So to make that as a general case is just not how it is. So the reason I don't believe the next door Catholic is like that on the news is because I know them. So that personal connection is the key. So that's why I recommend everybody from my personal experience. Like I said, I'm just a lay person. I have 4 kids. I have a job and many other things going on. But you can spend a little bit of a time to connect with your representatives, talk to someone, and start grassroots, and that will make a big difference, I think. So I'll look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashad. We're going to open up for questions in just a minute, but I'm also going to throw out the first question like the last panel. And because some of you answered different pieces of it, we'll go down the line, but if you can decide which parts, I'll put the 2 questions together. First, how did you get involved in this work? Since we're in an academic institution, we can talk about the catalyst for that and your backgrounds. And then what words of wisdom do you have for activists who may be feeling frustrated or defeated in this current political climate? Start with Corey.
Let me go with the second part, because the first part is a long story. It's a good one, but it's a long story. Words of wisdom. Frustration is normal if you want to be involved in public life. Any leader or any successful business person will talk to you about all the times that they've failed. And George Washington, who is considered the father of our country, lost pretty much every battle he fought except for a couple of really important ones. So if George Washington can fall flat on his face, so can we. And I say that because moving into this space, as other panelists have kind of pointed out, can be really kind of scary. I don't know what I'm doing. I might not do things right. And the answer to that is absolutely. You may not know what you're doing, but you're going to learn. And you may not be doing things right. You'll learn how to do it. The key is to be the person who decides it's time to change things. And I'm capable of doing so and believing in yourself. And the confidence comes from the successes that you get. So be willing to take the risk, make yourself feel a little uncomfortable, be willing to take the risk to fail, and I guarantee you the reward on the other side of it is amazing. Because for those failures, you get these wins, and it's incredible. And I will tell you, the short version of why I'm involved in this is because I just don't like bigotry, and I love sticking it to bigots. It's not something cool like I'm trying to save America for my children. In that moment, when I've been working against somebody who's trying to promote bigotry, and they go in frustration because I've gotten to them, I'm in their head, and they do something, like Corey Saylor is the most horrible person in the world, and I'm going like, yeah, right? That is just the greatest thing, and I just urge you to get involved because there will be frustrations, but the only way to stop the frustration is to be involved because then you can start delivering wins.
Thank you. John?
I would say I get the question a lot, particularly working on immigration issues and policy. You know, the bio says we've been involved in a number of coalitions doing immigration public policy. So you should be thinking like, gee, you must be really bad at it considering the nature of things. The reality, I would say, is in the moment that we're living, one of the reflections, both as an individual and collectively at ILCM and in those coalitions, we've kind of talked a couple of times about this is not the moment we expected to be living these last couple of years. Years and years, a decade and a half at least, of what most of the time felt like forward progress on creating a new federal immigration system came up against a very sharp U-turn. But our kind of refrain or rebuttal to that is that because of those years of work, we are exactly the persons, and I say this collectively, to be turning that U-turn around once again. Like, we have invested both time and knowledge and resources and case-by-case work into this bank of a more welcoming state, a more welcoming region, and we are the ones responsible for continuing to invest and turn that around. And I have great confidence that that has already happened. I share pretty widely some of the dramatic changes that we see at ILCM. We've seen a dramatic increase, Corey mentioned it earlier, of attorneys contacting us who have no background in immigration, but who want to be part of our pro bono work. If you think back to the Muslim ban being introduced, you know, Friday night, January 27th, 5:35 p.m. or something like that, within 24 hours, there were attorneys who had no idea about immigration, we'll be honest, occupying airports to make sure that basic immigration laws were observed by our own government. And that was unprecedented. I think extremely motivating for the general public to see that. And of course, that went on for weeks and weeks and months. We've seen it. We've started a new pro bono deportation defense project at our office, the most complex area of immigration law, and we have had investment from some of the top firms to say we want to be there to help you get this right, because we know and we can talk about the fact that when you have an attorney in deportation, you're 8 to 10 times more likely to succeed. Those kinds of things are motivating people. Folks contacting us to speak, folks contacting us to find out how they can donate money, both individual and large. I know that's not unique to ILCM. The last thing I would say is the challenge that I laid out for myself and to our staff and to our coalitions is how do we do things differently? The world has changed around us. The strategies we used didn't really allow us to accomplish, and in fact, you know, have been used against us in some ways. So how do we adapt? What are ways in which we do self-reflection on work we've done, and how do we change it? And for us, one of those ways is to be intentional about two things. One is to directly communicate and prioritize our outreach and education during the first year to directly impacted individuals by the administration. While we get, let's say, 20 requests for public presentations a month, we will prioritize those who are in harm's way because of the policies that are being generated. That was a shift. Not that we didn't do that, but to be intentional that these are folks who need, as much as we can clarify with the fast-moving pace of things, we will go to a church basement with 2 or 3 people versus who are directly affected versus, you know, a larger white-only organization who's curious. The second is in those ally spaces or the non-directly affected spaces, how do we be more intentional about talking to folks who have curiosity about anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim initiatives instead of just talking to progressives and liberals? And that one is a work in progress, but I think it is expanding and intentionally expanding to networks, to leaders, to law enforcement, to Republican leadership about why within the Republican Party, for example, both at the state and national levels, they have a real urgency to disassociate themselves with some of the negative messages coming from the executive branch and re-embrace kind of what we call the Chamber of Commerce position on the need for new Americans in Minnesota and in the United States. So those are a couple of suggestions.
Thanks, Rashad.
Sure. I think the question is that how did I get involved? I believe I answered that when I was a freshman in college. The second question is, what is the hope for people that are in this field that may get frustrated, right? So from my personal point of view, this is my hope, and this is a little religious answer. In Islam, our prophetic tradition, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he tells us when you don't have a shoe, look at someone who doesn't have a foot, maybe. So I believe that we live in the greatest nation of this earth today, because there are places where you cannot hold a conference like this. So we have a great opportunity to make a difference. This is a hope. The other hope is it's not just the Muslims that have been going through this. I think previous speakers have touched on this, and I'll be very clear. The Jewish people in this country have gone through these. The Catholics have gone through this before that, when they first came in New York and from Europe. Some of the rhetorics that are being used against the Muslims were exactly identical, and sometimes the word to word what was used for Jewish people, like they are choir, they're like greedy, there's like a whole group of people conspiring, it's like all in one group, they don't really fit in. Sounds familiar? It's the same things. So as a country in the past, this is my hope, that we have seen exactly the same things, and in every single time we have taken and chosen the right path forward. And I know that we will do that for Muslims. It's going on right now, and I hope it would be much faster, because now we live in a connected world. We have the internet, we have this and this, and people can't just pull in something and you can expose them right away. So I think it would be much faster. So that is the hope. And then that's my personal hope, based on reflecting on history. So one of the things I would like to say is not really the question, but I really want to say that too. From a GOP party, what I have seen so far is that there are many that do want to dissociate with this kind of anti-Islamic rhetorics, but they cannot for two reasons. One is the Islamophobes within the GOP party are very vocal. So when I went to my Senate district, when I was walking through the door, there was a big, huge, human-sized sign, picture of a senator calling him the jihadi Jim, because he was working with some Somalis on some bills or something. So if you don't pay him money, volunteer for him, he cannot speak up because he's not going to get elected. So that's as simple as it is. So people have to go support the voices of reason and be vocal, which if they do, that is going to be much louder than the voices that are very small. So I cannot emphasize. So if we are sitting there being frustrated, and it's kind of related to this answer, then do something. Do empower those voices that are nervous, that cannot speak up. Give them tools, give them talking points, pay them money, go door knock for them, and they will speak up, and then it would be overturned. So.
Thank you. Zarina?
Yeah, the one point I want to make, I know the topic today is Islamophobia, and it's focused on Muslims. The one point I do want to make is our issues are no different than anybody else's issues. We care about healthcare access, we care about educational access, we care about immigration, we care about environment, we care about guns. We don't like NRA, You know, so these are all the same issues that every American has. We only have put we seem to be fighting under the banner of Muslim because right now, today, we are the target of the Islamophobes. But as we educate ourselves, we also have to be aware that when we're doing the kind of work we're doing to uplift our community, we are actually uplifting the entire state of Minnesota. We're upholding the core values of United States because it is not anything different than anybody. As a parent, we all feel the same pain. As a community member, we all feel the same. At work, we feel discrimination. A lot of other people also feel discrimination. So when we focus on at a humanity level and uplift one group of people, we are literally uplifting everybody else. Because when we're fighting against the Muslim ban or the violence against Muslims, we also have to keep in mind that there are other individuals who were misunderstood or mistaken to be Muslims, were attacked and killed. And they're not members of our community. They are the members of the Sikh community. They're the members of the Hindu community. They may be Zoroastrians. But the message I want to give is Muslim issues are not in isolation of the rest of the American issues. And I think we have to keep that in mind. And the other suggestion I give as we engaged at the local level, at the political level, always have facts to back up your conversation. And there will be elements on both sides who may try to twist even your facts. I can give you one example. On a Muslim day on the Hill at the Capitol a couple months ago, I went and met with, some of us went and met with our state senator, who happens to be a Republican. And as I was trying to introduce to them the concept of who we are as Muslims, the first thing she said to me was, they don't let women drive in Saudi Arabia. I said, okay, I think Minnesota is very far away from Saudi Arabia. It's a totally different country with a totally different culture dictated by totally different norms. We may have the same, but I didn't go into that. That's what I wanted to say. But what I did was I countered her with a 2009 report, Gallup poll report, that was titled Muslim Americans Exemplify Diversity and Potential. I was trying to educate her about the potential we have within our community that can really help propel United States into beautiful directions from a science and innovation and technology perspective and so much more. But the point I told her that, you know, Muslim American women are among the most educated according to the Gallup poll 2009 report. Muslim American women are the most educated in the United States, second only to Jewish American women. A fact that just about everybody misses, yeah, and don't shine the light on. And the second fact is the highest degree of economy gender parity at the high and low ends of the income spectrum from a Muslim woman's perspective. So there's your potential right there. And she wanted to go back to say, oh, but there are Muslim men who don't let their women get access to health care. And so you will be discouraged by that kind of a narrative coming at you, but be prepared with facts and data to always counter that in a very professional manner. So I think that is a key. Those are the 2 points I wanted to make.
Thank you, Zarina. Now we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I think you had your hand up first, Beck.
I have a question about how questions are framed. That there was a mention of female genital mutilation. I think that just the framing of that question, there was recently a case about a doctor, yada, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. The thing about it is, if you go and have plastic surgery, is that mutilation? So it's not a mutilation. We don't say that male circumcision is a genital mutilation.
Does somebody want to just address framing questions?
Sure. I mean, this is one of the things that I talked about in the caucus when it came to be. So I took the question literally. It says female genital mutilation. So if somebody is wanting to mutilate somebody's body part, I think that's illegal. So I told them, why do you think it's going to be part of somebody's religion, which religion existed for 1400 years? And this is a practice. So just again, with the facts, what exists in parts of the world that it spans across religion. It's not just Muslims who does that practice, and whatever that may be, because I'm not an expert in these little details of this mutilation or what that is. Frankly, I didn't even know what that was growing up as a Muslim in Bangladesh, which happens to be the third largest Muslim country of the world, led by 2 female for the last 20 years, democratically elected. So I have never heard what that was until I came here. So I didn't know what that is. So you're absolutely right, but I think what I would say to that is when you are talking to people, when the kind of people that brought these up, many of them are unfortunately not that, what's the good word to say, not that deep that you can really go play with the words and say, okay, mutilation means this and that. It gets a little difficult. That is a perfect question to go into an academic setting, present a paper and an argument of for and this, and I'm going there with like raw emotions and like what that is. So I just try to say what I think is right, and that's kind of how I'm approaching it. So I think there is the approach to that question, it varies the audience who you are talking to.
Thank you, Rashid. Another question? I think you were second, gentleman in the blue shirt.
So the conversation so far seems to be overwhelmingly policy in terms of law. And I'm wondering if any of you would care to, and if not, that's, I don't want to take it off focus, but policy in terms of how government agencies turn the law or turn their mission into actual practices and delivery or non-delivery. And John, you mentioned briefly, for instance, failure to enforce existing laws in some ways, or are there other examples? I'm an employee of the State Department of Human Services, for instance, so mostly health in various ways, although I work in child support. But are there, are there anything you care to comment in terms of the way agencies perform their missions, and especially because usually we hear that in the context of race, so to speak, but are there specifically religious or religion-based examples that you care to point?
John, do you want to take that? Oh, Corey, you look like you're...
If you have an idea.
Well, so I was trying to pull the statistic back up again, but in the introductory session, I talked about how the Department of Justice is multiple times more likely to issue a press release when the perpetrator of an incident is perceived as being Muslim. And you can see across many spectrums that the law is equal, but the application of the law, I don't even know quite the right word. Maybe a lawyer will have a better term for it. But it is insanely unequal. And the response to that remains essentially the same. A vigilant citizenry that where we have lawyers, we point that out and push back against it. Where we have people who are enthusiastic about it, we organize and we make noise about it. And I always like to point to the Cuban American community as a stellar example of how a very small group of people can have a massively outsized impact on U.S. policy. So U.S. policy toward China, how do we undo communism in China? Open markets, right? Flood them with capitalism. How do we do it in Cuba? For a long time it was embargo, right? And why two completely different things to deal with the same issue of communism? In many ways it was because of the Cuban American community. So a very small, vocal, organized group can have a monster impact on things. So very much so. These agencies are aware of it, and I can go on for a while, I just don't want to dominate time, about how agencies have been compelled to be more equal in their application of rules that they are supposed to enforce.
Thanks, Corey. John, if
Yeah,
you
I-
want to talk a little bit about the conflation of immigration and some of the ways.
There's a lot of directions I could take the question. I would just say in summary, or to kind of to talk about it in a general sense, if you think of it on the federal level, DACA, the program DACA, did not pass any of the houses, either of the houses, and was done through the executive branch, through administrative interpretation. There's a precedent of doing it. We contend that it was both legal and constitutional that Obama did it. The downside, and these are lessons learned, I think, over a long period of time, is the downside of agencies or executive or even a new mayor with a new way of interpreting things at the local level is that they are equally prone or vulnerable to whoever follows that leader. And I think the same is true at the commissioner levels. It is not by chance that most of those decision makers in the executive branches, whether it be federal, state, or local, get those positions, by whoever was elected at the top of that food chain. So we've seen now the counter side of DACA being the rescission of DACA. We've seen the counter side of prosecutorial discretion in deportation be zero enforcement by the new secretary or the attorney general and president. All of that is to say it sucks, it's hard, but we are as engaged as possible on all of those levels, and sometimes it's the only areas that we're able to engage on and bring about change, even if it is that temporary positive or the slowing down or stopping of the temporary negative. We don't have driver's licenses for all Minnesotans in Minnesota because of an executive level decision by Tim Pawlenty in 2003. That's 15 years if you kind of think about the impact that those executive decisions can have.
Great, thanks. I got notice that we can go until 12:15, so we can take some more questions. Did you have a? And
you can leave if you need to leave.
Yeah, and you can leave if you need to leave. I'm sorry, she was next, and then you.
Okay, so John.
Yeah.
You mentioned a statistic or estimation that like 50% of entries are 18 years.
Refugee entries.
Or younger. And as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of policy or expectation that those children, unaccompanied minors, whomever, are, I guess, followed, or that we know where they end up, that if they, after a certain set of years, that they report back or whatever. And so I'm sort of curious, I guess, if anyone has any experience or knowledge about how that impacts unaccompanied minor refugee children, if we're not, I guess, paying attention to where they end up and where they are a year after they arrive. So yeah.
So I want to be kind of step back a little bit, and the specific data that I was sharing was around refugee arrivals in Minnesota. So 50%, 47%, I think this is cumulative through 2016, and it's in that auditor report. I think it's it's important to have people go back and look at that, the March 1st, 2018 legislative auditor report. It jumped out at me because we've so often seen, I believe, a political agenda to say refugees or undocumented immigrants cost us so much money, which is another way of, somebody used the term commodifying Islamophobia. This is sort of commodifying undesirable newcomers. And it's more sweeping because you can sweep everybody up in it. But when you dig through who are they actually talking about, they're talking about children. And so that was my point. When you're going to talk about the cost of a child who was born abroad but is underage when they arrive here, there may be a year or two, depending on the age of ESL or ELL, but most of those kids have, especially if you arrive young, are speaking English as fluently, if not more fluently, by the time they're in kindergarten. And we don't sort of say, what is the breakdown of costs of American-born children. On the other part of your question, for unaccompanied minors, that in an immigration perspective, that is all about Central American kids arriving right now, and I'm assuming that was part of your question. The reality, even under Obama, is that almost all unaccompanied minors entering the U.S. Are interviewed. They proactively are seeking protection when they reach the southern border, turn themselves in and say, these are the reasons why I left and what I fear, and are given, after usually short periods of custody by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they're given court dates and are resettled with family members or close family members across the U.S. So that is the job of the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement in Minnesota. We represent, I know the Advocates represents dozens and dozens of these young kids, and they are required to show up in court for their ongoing hearings. So there is an expectation that they are being tracked and being required to show up. Not all of them do, but it's the exception when they don't, and usually it's because of other trauma that's been going on in their life, rather than a willful ignoring of it. I think the other part I would just say, and sorry to ramble on, it does not mean, and maybe this was part of your question, it does not mean for the best interests of the child that the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement is doing exhaustive follow-up work to make sure the child, once they're resettled, outside of the border or into the interior of the U.S., is and remains in a safe setting. So that is a concern. We see it rarely, but occasionally, where a child has been placed in a home that's not safe, and usually they, as teenagers and young adults, they self-select to a safer space, and hopefully through school or through a counselor or a friendly neighbor. One of our clients in rural Minnesota, the soccer team, a mom on the soccer team realized he wasn't going home and he was sleeping at the soccer fields. And so she took him in and found us, and we helped him. So those things happen, and it's not perfect, but I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Go ahead.
After the last presidential election, a small group of women, we formed an alliance. We are now 900 members and 200 really active members. We show up at the Capitol. We call. We write. We educate. We are connected to different groups throughout the St. Clair Valley. However, trying to get into Kathy Loam was like trying to break into the U.S. Senate. And you had mentioned earlier how important it is for us to meet with our political representatives. Literally, we have done everything but stall. What recommendations do you have for us, especially we do have a member from our group who's running against her,
Yeah.
and she is a strong woman, deep connections, and it's hard to shift her. We are discouraged, and we're not happy about being discouraged, especially in relation to her. Could you please give us a piece of advice that I can take back and share with the others?
Somebody want to take that?
I don't have a magic recipe. I would say don't give up. I'm represented by Jason Lewis. And the amazing thing that has transformed Jason Lewis as he runs for re-election the second time is that he feels the heat, and he thinks he's more at risk of not being re-elected than last time. And suddenly, about 3 weeks ago, he announced he's going to conduct his first town halls of his, 2 terms. That is because of activism. Maybe, they didn't get in to see him, but they made it known and made it public how hard it was to get in to see him, or to, Angie Craig running against him has made it very clear that he is not holding town hall meetings. So I think there's the inside activism, which you're talking about, of trying to meet with them, reason with them, and change them. And it is not uncommon that does not work. So don't feel discouraged. But but also be as creative as possible in using outside tactics. And that's really, I think, part of that inside and outside game, that different groups are stronger at one than another, but linking up to do both inside and outside is really important. And until she feels that her electability is at risk, she'll continue to ignore you, unfortunately.
And I would often suggest that if someone has decided to close the door in your face, go find somebody who's willing to open it and promote their campaign. You have a lot of energy that you want to put into something. Stop banging your head on the wall. Find another candidate who's the right one. There's also, if somebody has closed a door, it's amazing how a little bit of embarrassment in the media can motivate them. I can tell you a major corporation had closed the bank accounts of a number of Muslim organizations. Those Muslim organizations had tried to contact this bank multiple times. The bank was just ignoring them. I went, found a bank location where I could hold a press conference with their logo in the background and announced a press conference, and I had the CEO on the phone 3 hours later. Mr. Saylor, can you please cancel the press conference? We're very concerned and we want to hear your issues. And it was like, no, I can't cancel it, and welcome to it, buddy. So you sit through and you think about different ways that, one, you can support somebody who's going to be more amenable to communication with you, and two, bring the other person to the table through political pressure. And that's a much longer conversation, but I know there's more than a few of us in the room that have ideas on that front, I'm sure.
I can give an example of how the Muslim community is doing that, because we're also in a similar situation. We show up, we go to rallies, we do everything. But for the midterm elections, the Muslim Caucus here in the state has partnered with Faith Minnesota. It's a sister organization of Isaiah Group, which is a conglomeration of 200 churches. And between the two of us, we have about 150 delegates. I'm one of them. That we are now showcasing that as a power block that could potentially have an impact on the gubernatorial races. So in that way, we built that power, and now the candidates are coming to us saying, okay, what are your issues? What can we do to help you? So building coalitions, again, with like-minded organizations, I think is something that'll be helpful.
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
I was just going to offer, I think it's time to really use our creative powers. And there's the idea of phone calls and dinners and meetings. But what if you got 30 people and Windex and just started squirting the office buildings and saying, oh, we're just trying to get a look inside. And get a neighborhood newspaper there. Use other means that are maybe a little more theatrical or performance oriented that are going to someone's going to take a picture of that, and then everybody has the same line. We're just trying to get a meeting. We're just trying to see what's inside. And it, to your point, it's either humiliation or it's just a little bit of fun, and the message will spread. And I just think we're in a time of craziness, so let's try other means.
That's good. Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Rashid, I loved when you said that we need to empower voices that may be nervous to speak in support of Muslims. And living in St. Cloud and working with John, I'm in CD6, and every single one is Republican, and my whole family votes Republican, and so do I, depending on the race. And what I see in St. Cloud is that that's just a stop block. What has been used against us in St. Cloud is political parties and folks that come in just around election season and decide to do things like hold press conferences all of a sudden, or town halls. What's your suggestion for folks to come together across party lines, which I know would be great, but especially when we have majority Republican folks that feel like if I step out, in St. Cloud, if you step out, you lose your friends, you're banned from churches. It's real stuff.
Yeah, it is very difficult, I think. I think the way is, what I did is, and I can't name names, but one of the representatives I spoke to was had very anti-Islamic views. This isn't the one that I would like to encourage. But then as a Muslim, I'm instructed religiously to think good of people first. And like, in other words, innocent until proven guilty. So I'm thinking good of that person. Try to find common grounds. And then you keep engaging with them, not just one time. You go to the BPOU meetings, like monthly BPOU meetings, show up there, so they see you, then slowly these barriers go down, and then you do that. In terms of helping those people, I have hosted fundraiser in my house. Money or vote, that's all will matter. And then they will realize that, okay, now I can speak for someone's like that. So I hosted fundraiser for someone who actually was the only GOP gubernatorial candidate, attended Muslim events. So that's how I try to empower, not just with thoughts and prayers and blessings, but go door knock and help them, empower them. And that's I think the only way we can do, like continuous engagement, not at one time. Yes.
I have actually a yes or no question, so it shouldn't take very long.
Okay.
When I was working with MoveOn, which was of course now a number of years ago, one of the things they talked about was the power of writing letters to the editor. So my question is, do you all feel like there are two things that may or may not have impacted us in the movement? One is letters to the editor, and the other is meeting with aides. If we can't get in to meet with representatives, is it useful? How useful is it to continue to try to meet with their aides rather than keep knocking on doors for the acting representative?
That's great, and that will have to be our last question. So why don't, whichever or all of you want to answer that?
Yes on the letters to the editor, always. Aides, yes to the extent they're not just giving you the equivalent of interns.
Agree 100%. I take letters to the editor a little step further, kind of enhanced, and say, if you don't have the skills, find somebody who has the skills to do an op-ed or a profile piece for your local papers. Local papers are constantly looking for content. As the age of real journalists goes away or weakens, we can help them do their job, and we've been successful at ILCM of getting simple profiles of successful immigrants and refugees in greater Minnesota, in those, including Muslims, to sort of say, you live with these people, you don't know them, and here they are.
I think I'll skip. I think I agree with what they said. So,
Zarina?
Absolutely.
Great. Well,
And-
thank
and
you
don't
all
forget
so
to
much.
use, social media, because that's a very powerful
Social
tool
media.
these days. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
Social media.
Serena.
Oh, no, I said don't forget to use social media. It's a very powerful tool these days.
Yes, thank you. And